Zach Paikoff here, and welcome back to another lesson video. Today, I will be doing an overview of our next unit, which is accounting. So let's jump right into the video. Okay, so as I said before, we are going to be starting a brand new unit today on accounting. And the online textbook that we're going to be using is Century 21 Southwestern Accounting, Multi-Column Journal, 9th edition. And within this online textbook, we will be learning about how to account for different types of businesses. And we're going to be focusing on 3: sole proprietorships, corporations, and partnerships. So in a moment, I will be going over the different chapters with you guys and what we'll be accounting for within those chapters. And although I have not used this textbook, believe it or not, I have actually used the 10th edition. This book has very similar concepts compared to the 10th edition. So let's take a look at the different chapters together. All right, so now I will be going over the different chapters with you guys and what we'll be learning about within those chapters. So in part 1, we will be learning about how to account for a service business organized as a proprietorship. So in chapter 1, we are going to be learning about how to start a proprietorship and also changes that affect the accounting equation. So we'll be learning about the accounting equation, how business activities change the accounting equation, and how transactions change owner's equity in an accounting equation. Next, we'll be moving on to Chapter 2, where we'll be learning about how to analyze transactions into debit and credit parts. So we'll be learning about how to use T accounts, analyzing how transactions affect accounts, and analyzing how transactions affect owner's equity accounts. Then we'll be moving on to Chapter 3, where we'll be learning about journalizing transactions. So we'll be learning about journals, source documents, and recording entries in a journal, journalizing buying insurance, buying on account, and paying on account, journalizing transactions that affect owner's equity and receiving cash on account, and proving and ruling a journal. Then we'll be moving on to Chapter 4, where we'll be learning about how to post to a general ledger. So we'll be learning about how to prepare a chart of accounts, posting separate amounts from a journal to a general ledger, posting column totals from a journal to a general ledger, and completing accounting forms and making correcting entries. Next, we'll be moving on to Chapter 5, where we'll be learning about cash control systems. So we'll be learning about checking accounts, bank reconciliations, dishonored checks and electronic banking, and petty cash. Then we'll be moving on to Chapter 6, which is where we'll be learning about a worksheet for a service business. So within this chapter, we'll be learning about how to create a worksheet, plan adjusting entries on a worksheet, extend financial statement information on a worksheet, and find and correct errors on the worksheet. Then we'll be moving on to Chapter 7, which is financial statements for a proprietorship. So we'll be learning about how to prepare an income statement and balance sheet information on a worksheet. And finally, we'll be moving on to Chapter 8, which is the last chapter in Part 1. So this chapter is called Recording, Adjusting, and Closing Entries for a Service Business. And within this chapter, we will be learning about how to record closing entries, record closing entries, and prepare a post-closing trial balance. So that is the end of Part 1. These are the first 8 chapters which make up Part 1. So now I will be moving on to Part 2. Okay, so now I will be moving on to Part 2, where we'll be learning about how to account for a merchandising business organized as a corporation. So in Chapter 9, we will be learning about journalizing purchases and cash payments. And within this chapter, we will be learning about journalizing purchases using a purchases journal, journalizing cash payments using a cash payments journal, performing additional cash payments journal operations, and journalizing other transactions using a general journal. Then we'll be moving on to Chapter 10, which is called Journalizing Sales and Cash Receipts Using Special Journals. So in this chapter, we will be learning about journalizing sales on account using a sales journal, journalizing cash receipts using a cash receipts journal, and recording transactions using a general journal. Next, we'll be moving on to Chapter 11, where we'll be learning about how to post to general and subsidiary ledgers. So within this chapter, we will be learning about how to post to an accounts payable ledger, how to post to an accounts receivable ledger, how to post from journals to a general ledger, and how to post special journal totals to a general ledger. Also, we'll be learning about how to correct errors in subsidiary ledger accounts. Then we'll be moving on to Chapter 12. We'll be learning about how to prepare payroll records. So within this chapter, we'll be learning about preparing payroll time cards, determining payroll tax withholding, preparing payroll records, and preparing payroll checks. In Chapter 13, we'll be learning about payroll accounting, taxes, and reports. So we'll be learning about how to record a payroll, record employer payroll taxes, reporting withholding and payroll taxes, and paying withholding and payroll taxes. Next, we'll be moving on to Chapter 14, which is the longest chapter in this book, and that is called Distributing Dividends and Preparing a Worksheet for a Merchandising Business. So within this chapter, we'll be learning about how to distribute corporate earnings to stockholders, begin an 8-column worksheet for a merchandising business, planning and recording a merchandising inventory adjustment, planning and recording an allowance for uncollectible accounts adjustment, planning and recording depreciation adjustments, and calculating federal income tax and completing a worksheet. Next, we'll be moving on to Chapter 15, where we'll be learning about financial statements for a corporation. So we'll be learning about how to prepare an income statement, how to analyze an income statement, how to prepare a statement of stockholders' equity, and how to prepare a balance sheet. Then we'll be moving on to Chapter 16, which is called Recording Adjusting and Closing Entries for a Corporation. So within this chapter, we will be learning about how to record adjusting entries, how to record closing entries for income statement accounts, and how to prepare a post-closing trial balance. And that is the end of Part 2, which is Chapters 9 through 16. So now I will be moving on to Part 3. Alright, so now we'll be moving on to Part 3, where we'll be learning about how to account for a merchandising business organized as a corporation, and we'll be doing stuff with adjustments and valuation. So in Chapter 17, we'll be learning about how to account for uncollectible accounts receivable. And within this chapter, we'll be learning about uncollectible accounts and how to write off and collect uncollectible accounts receivable. Next, we'll be moving on to Chapter 18, where we'll be learning about how to account for plan assets and depreciation. So within this chapter, we'll be learning about how to buy plan assets and pay property tax, calculate depreciation expense, journalize depreciation expense, dispose plan assets, and the declining balance method of depreciation. Next, we'll be moving on to Chapter 19, where we'll be learning about how to account for inventory. And within this chapter, we'll be learning about how to determine the quantity of merchandise inventory, determine the cost of merchandise inventory, and estimate inventory. Then we'll be moving on to Chapter 20, where we'll be learning about how to account for notes and interest. So within this chapter, we'll be learning about promissory notes, notes payable, and notes receivable. Then we'll be moving on to Chapter 21, where we'll be learning about how to account for accrued revenue and expenses. So in this chapter, we'll be learning about accrued revenue and accrued expenses. And finally, we'll be learning about, in Chapter 22, we'll be learning about end of fiscal period work for a corporation. And this chapter pretty much wraps up our corporations. So in this chapter, we'll be learning about how to prepare a worksheet for a corporation, how to prepare an income statement, how to prepare a statement of stockholders' equity and balance sheet, and adjusting, closing, and reversing entries for a corporation. So that is the end of Part 3. Now I'll be moving on to Part 4, which is the last part of our accounting unit. Okay, so now I will be going over Part 4, which is the last part of our accounting unit, and in this part, we'll be learning about how to account for additional procedures. So in Chapter 23, we'll be learning about how to account for partnerships. And within this chapter, we'll be learning about how to form a partnership, how to distribute net income and owner's equity statements, and how to dissolve a partnership. And finally, in Chapter 24, we'll be learning about how to record international and internet sales. So within this chapter, we'll be learning about how to record international sales and how to record internet sales. And that is the last chapter in our accounting unit. So now I will be going over how I will be doing these accounting videos with you guys. Alrighty, so the way that I'm going to be doing these accounting videos with you guys is by chunking them. And what I mean by that is I'll be reading the text, and in the next video, I'll be going over the work together or application problem depending on the section. So for example, if we were on Chapter 3 and I read the 3-1 text, the next video I'd be going over the 3-1 work together. So that's how we're going to be doing the accounting units, and we'll be using the Microsoft and Google Suite to help us with the accounting problems. So we'll be using Microsoft Excel, Google Sheets, Microsoft Word, and Google Docs. So in the next video, I'll be going over part 1, which is where we'll be learning about how to account for a service business organized as a proprietorship. Okay, I hope to see you then. Bye.